Hi, this is Ron Sipsic. In this particular segment, we're going to take a look at what is called a market imperfection. In this case, the market fails. It does. You go, well, what does it fail at? It fails in operating at the optimal output level and the optimal price. And so in this case, there'll be a role for government to play in helping the market find its optimal price and quantity. The particular example we want to look at this point is something called a negative externality. A negative externality is actually a case where a cost is imposed on an innocent third party. For instance, let's think about the case of air pollution. Let's talk about perhaps an electricity company, a company that is taking coal or some other input, natural gas, and producing electricity. In that particular case, if the electricity plant releases air pollution into the air, rather than taking the steps to properly control that pollution, it imposes a cost on third parties, people that have to breathe the air, perhaps incur healthcare costs or cleanliness costs. For instance, cities where there's lots of air pollution, you have to wash your car more, your house looks dingier and dirtier. Besides the fact that things are just in general dirty, people are incurring health costs as a result of breathing that dirty air, those particulates that are in the air. So pollution in this case is really, from the standpoint of the electricity company, low cost or no cost disposal of a bad. Smoke is a bad. It's a byproduct of the production process. In producing electricity, you're going to get a byproduct called smoke, particularly if you're using something like coal to actually produce the electricity. And that bad imposes a negative externality or an external cost on third parties. So let's go ahead and move down and we'll take a look at this. And we'll also take a look at how government can help correct this problem. Before we look at that, though, we need to understand what the problem actually is. So in this case, what I've done is drawn a crude model of the electricity production process. The coal is input. An input, of course, there are other inputs that go into making electricity, but coal is of particular interest because it's a relatively dirty input. The electricity company takes the coal. In the process of generating electricity, it's going to be releasing smoke into the air. This smoke, of course, is going to go down, and it's going to actually hurt people who breathe it. Okay? And the healthcare costs or cleanup costs of this smoke are imposed on people who are not really directly a party to the transaction. Notice that smoke is actually a complement in production with respect to electricity. But the problem is smoke is a bad, not a good. So in this case, we're getting complements in production. We're getting a good called electricity, but we're also getting a bad called smoke. Now, if the electricity company were serious about taking care of this smoke, it could put a scrubber on this smokestack, and this scrubber, let me just go ahead and spell that out. This scrubber could catch many of the particulates that are going up in the air and could capture those particulates, and then of course that it's like a big cigarette filter that could be cleaned out, maintained. Of course, in pulling the particulates, and literally tons of these particulates would be caught in this scrubber. These particulates would have to be trucked away, taken to a landfill, and properly disposed of. So the point is, when we run a scrubber on a smokestack, it's very, very expensive. This is a very expensive treatment of the smoke. And the point is, these costs have to be borne by the electricity company and ultimately passed on to the consumer. So the polluting electricity company avoids these costs and basically passes these costs on to third parties. By not absorbing these costs into its cost structure, the electricity market is actually undercosting, which ultimately means underpricing electricity and ultimately overproducing it. And we'll see that in just a minute. So again, the main idea to pick up at this point is that pollution is basically no cost or low cost disposal to the electricity company, with those costs being imposed on innocent third parties who have no way to remedy that problem unless government steps in. All right, so let's go ahead and move down and see how this is shown in supply and in the world of supply and demand. So here is our electricity market. Let me go ahead and switch my color there. Here's the electricity market, and there are suppliers of electricity, utility companies, and there are demanders of electricity, all the users, both household users and commercial users. Now, the problem is the supply curve for electricity is only, at this point, accounting for what we call internal costs. Internal costs are those costs that are borne directly by the firm, and any internal cost is ultimately passed on to the consumer in the way of price. So all internal costs must be passed on to the consumer. And the reason for this is electricity companies are profitable. Their shareholders require that they earn a profit. So the electricity company is not only going to pass on all of its internal costs, but have to earn some sort of profit on top of those internal costs. So ultimately, the costs of electricity are borne by consumers. That's a key idea. Consumers ultimately pay all of the costs of electricity because electricity companies are profitable. If electricity companies were not profitable, they wouldn't stay in business, and the government would have to step in and subsidize them. In that case, it could be, and we see this in certain countries where there's a lot of command. We see government-controlled utility companies where the utility companies actually do not cover all of their costs. In other words, they do not pass all of their costs on to consumers, which means they need to be subsidized by the government. What I'm assuming here is this is a market system where all of the electricity costs must be passed on to the consumer, so the electricity user ultimately covers all of the costs of production. The problem is these internal costs are underestimating the true costs of production. After all, the electricity companies are not properly disposing of their waste. So if we were to account for all of the costs of producing electricity, the supply curve for electricity would be where? It would be much further to the what? To the left. And so notice I now draw, sorry about that, let me go ahead and erase that with my erasing function, if I can get it to work. I think I can. So let me go back to my pen. And notice I've introduced a new supply curve in here. This is called S2. And S2 accounts for internal, and external costs. So in other words, what I'm now including is not only internal costs, but I'm including the external costs that have been imposed on third parties. So if this market were to account for all of the costs of production, where would its supply curve be? It would be further to the left. External costs are these negative externalities. Okay, so external costs equal negative externalities. Notice that by imposing or including these external costs on the market or into the cost structure, the supply curve is further to the what? It's further to the left, which means what? The price is what? The price is higher, and the quantity is what? The quantity is lower. So in essence, if we forced consumers to pay for the cleanup costs of electricity, in other words, to pay for the proper disposal of the byproducts, the smoke or whatever that comes out of electricity production, consumers would have to pay more for electricity and not as much electricity would be consumed, which says something very, very important. Cleanliness is costly. Let's go ahead and make a note of that. That's worth noting. I know some people think cleanliness is next to godliness. I'm not going to make that argument. All I'm saying is cleanliness is costly. So if you want a cleaner environment, you basically have to incur higher costs. In other words, cleanliness is what? Cleanliness, you could say this too, cleanliness is scarce. Uh-oh. Yeah. In a civilized world where people mess things up, dirty things up, if you don't think you do this, think of your bedroom right now, or think of your kitchen, or think of other areas in your home. As you use your home, you inevitably make things dirty. It takes time, but not really time. Time devoted to cleaning up is time not devoted to other things. Time not devoted to maybe something you'd like to do, a hobby or something, or it's time not devoted to working per se, at a job where you could earn income. So keeping your house clean means you give up something, which means cleanliness is costly. It is impossible to live in a civilized world where there are human beings in close quarters without imposing, without making things dirty, and without needing cost to be incurred to keep things clean. Okay? Cleanliness is costly. And obviously in a market setting where companies are producing things, they're going to be making a mess when they produce things. And some of the things that are produced, electricity for instance, is very, very dirty. Very dirty. Now America has, even with coal, done a much better job than some other nations with coal. We hear the horror stories, for instance, in mainland China, where walking around Beijing, the capital of mainland China, when you walk around for a day, 24 hours or so, if you're on the ground in mainland China for a day, you're going to breathe the equivalent of 3 to 4 packs of the smoke just in the air. You're going to, it's the equivalent of smoking 3 or 4 packs of cigarettes. It's that dirty. And all sorts of measures need to be taken by the citizens of Beijing to not breathe this stuff. They have to wear breathing apparatus, and they have to limit the amount of time they spend walking and working in certain areas of the city. It's extremely, the air quality in Beijing is extremely low. Why? Because companies are not required to deal with their external costs. Rivers in Beijing, extremely dirty. Why? Because companies are not required, at least to the same standard as America, to keep pollutants out of the waterways. So waterways and airways are just terribly dirty, and this is the cost of, this is a cost inherent with manufacturing, heavy manufacturing. Say what you will about made in China, but manufacturing in China means less pollution in America. And until China begins to force these companies to impose, until the governments of China begin to force these companies to clean up and keep their air and waterways clean, China will always have an advantage, because in America we force manufacturers to produce much more cleanly than the Chinese do. So manufacturing in China, you automatically have a cost advantage because there's not as much pressure on you to produce cleanly. Okay, so let's go ahead and now look at the question of, well, what can government do? What can government do about this problem? And there's a number of options here. So this is going to be a case where government has a role to play in causing the market to operate at the right output rate. Now let me back up a second here. I'm getting all excited and getting all out ahead of myself. Where should this market operate? This market should operate where? The optimal quantity is QE2. The optimal price is PE2. Why? Because this price and this quantity account for all of the costs of production. So if the market is allowed just to operate on its own, what will it do? It will what? It will underprice. It will underprice. So a free market the free market will underprice electricity, and the free market will what? The free market will overproduce electricity in this case. Yeah, well, that's not bad. That's good. Cheap electricity, lots of it, that's good. But keep in mind, electricity in this case is a high pollution product. So what we're saying is we're underpricing and we're overproducing a high pollution product, a product that is imposing external costs on third parties. That is not desirable. So point one is a market outcome. Sorry, I'm going to have a lot of room there. That is what we would call suboptimal. Suboptimal means less than optimal. The optimal market outcome would be 0.2 because we're properly pricing and producing electricity. Okay? All right, so what can government do to move us from 0.1 towards 0.2? What can government do to increase the price of electricity, reduce the quantity, in other words, shift the supply curve to the right? Let's take a look at that. One option would be regulation. So let's write that out. Okay, I want black there. There we go. So government regulation of the polluter. So this is relatively straightforward. Increase regulations. In other words, impose a regulation on the polluting utility company. Say to the utility company, look, you must scrub your smoke, and we expect it to be at a certain level of cleanliness, which we are going to establish. We'll determine the health standard. You have to meet the standard. If you don't meet the standard, we shut you down. So this increase in regulation does what? It's going to increase the cost of production. And this electricity company is going to need to put a scrubber on its smokestack. This increases the internal cost of electricity. The effect of that is to decrease the supply of electricity. Okay? This, of course, is a leftward shift. This leftward shift in the electricity supply curve does two things. It what? Increases PE and decreases QE, which is exactly what we're looking for. All right? So basically what we've done is we've converted, this is very important, we have converted external costs to internal costs. Okay? Now, there's a second method that governments often use. This is less severe. It gives businesses a little bit more choice in how to deal with a problem. But you could tax the polluter. You could tax the polluter. Let's go ahead and write that out. What do you mean tax the polluter? Well, we impose a tax on the basis of how much the firm pollutes. The more you pollute, the more you get taxed. The less you pollute, the less you get taxed. And what we do is we take measurements. We measure your air quality, which is fairly easy to do. We can set a standard, and we could set a no tax standard. In other words, a certain level of pollution might be acceptable, but anything above a certain level would require you to pay a tax on the amount you pollute. Well, taxes do what? They increase the cost of production. They're an internal cost. And again, if you increase the internal costs of the firm, you decrease the firm's supply, which again is leftward, and that has the impact of driving the price of electricity up and decreasing the quantity. This is almost equivalent to what we'd call a sin tax. We're basically taxing the polluter for bad behavior, and we let the polluter behave that way, but we make them pay more for sinning, for polluting, if you will. So this is the sin tax. Now, you can imagine here that if I'm being taxed on the amount I pollute, I have an incentive to try to figure out ways to produce without polluting and avoid these taxes. Whenever you impose taxes, the person being taxed looks for ways to avoid it. So this is going to encourage the polluter to look for ways to produce the product without polluting. In essence, you're going to convert, again, external cost to internal costs. You're encouraging the firm to come up with methods to avoid polluting, and that is going to lead them to incur costs, internal costs, that reduce pollution. And it has roughly the same effect as regulation. It's not as severe in that the regulated firm is forced to abide by the rule, where the taxed firm can actually choose to pollute but has to pay more to pollute. Okay? But nevertheless, you've created an economic incentive for the firm to stop polluting. There's a third option that I want to look at, and let me go ahead and move this up a little bit. And that third option would be to government could create a market for what are called ECs. ECs are environmental credits. Environmental credits. And again, the government is involved in all three of these. Here, let me just put a little government creates. Put a little wedge in there. Government creates a market for environmental credits. You go, what do you mean by that? All right, let me show you an example here. Now, this is a very primitive example of this, very basic example, but just give you kind of an idea. Let me go ahead and use an example here. Suppose there are two companies. There's ABC Company, and ABC is a dirty company. It's a relatively messy producer. Say there's a company XYZ Company, and XYZ Company is a relatively green, clean company. Okay, green and clean. All right, so what do you mean ABC is dirty? It pollutes at a relatively high level. So say it's polluting at its standard of pollution is 10 parts per billion, 10 ppb. So this is a measurement of dirtiness. The higher the measurement, the worse the pollution. So 10 parts per billion, 10 particulates per billion of this particular thing that we don't want in the air. Okay? And then say that XYZ Company is a relatively clean company in that it only pollutes at 6 parts per billion. So it pollutes, but it pollutes much less, 40% less than ABC, the dirty company. Okay? Let's say that the government has determined a standard, and the standard is, let's say, 8 parts per billion. So the standard goes all the way across, and that's 8 parts per billion, and that's called the standard, and that's considered satisfactory. So if you hit the standard, you're okay, you're not in trouble. But if you're above the standard, you're in trouble. So what do we got here? We've got ABC Company, which is what? 2 parts per billion above standard. We've got XYZ Company, which is what? 2 parts per billion below standard. So XYZ is, making the government very happy because it's relatively clean compared to standard. ABC is not making the government very happy because it's actually 2 parts per billion above standard. What we're going to do is we're going to penalize ABC company for its dirtiness by requiring it to buy, it will have to buy 2 environmental credits. Why? It essentially is 2 parts per billion above standard. It now effectively must buy, it owes 2 environmental credits. In essence, its dirtiness has created a situation where it's in debt. It's in debt to society. Whereas XYZ company, because it's 2 parts per billion below standard, it is in a position where it may sell 2 environmental credits. In other words, they're like little gold stars. XYZ gets 2 gold stars for being below standard and has the right to sell these as credits to some dirty firm. So you can see what happens here. I've made this very simple and straightforward. XYZ is in a position to sell these 2 environmental credits to another producer in its area who requires 2 environmental credits. So in other words, XYZ can profit from its cleanliness, and ABC incurs a cost for its what? For its dirtiness. And this, of course, creates a wonderful incentive. You reward clean companies and allow them to sell environmental credits, and you effectively punish dirty companies, requiring them to pay for their dirtiness. And in essence, you create an incentive for dirty companies to get cleaner, and you create an incentive for clean companies to get even cleaner. And of course, if everyone is below standard, then you can simply lower the standard. All right, so if both of these companies and all other companies in this particular geographic area who are polluting the air, if everyone's below standard, that means a lower standard is appropriate. You can set a lower standard when everyone can beat standard. And this, of course, creates market pressure on both types of firms to get cleaner. The dirty firm must get cleaner so it doesn't incur costs, and the clean firms have an incentive to be cleaner because they can profit from their cleanliness. So this is very primitive. Now these environmental credit systems can be configured in different ways, but this is just a very simple example of how one could work, and you can see that this creates market incentives. So let's make a note here. Let me just go ahead and change the color here. The EC system, which is effectively a government-created market, creates an incentive to be what? To be clean. All right. So again, the issue is negative externalities, that in the process of producing something, you're going to make things dirty. If the firm incurs those costs and embeds them in the price of the product, those costs being the cleanup costs, there's no problem. The market operates where it should. But if firms fail to internalize the cost of cleanup and impose external costs on third parties, which, let's face it, many firms do, they do it either intentionally or inadvertently, then the government can step in and cause the market to actually operate in a better place by forcing companies to address their external costs. And this again is called the case of negative externalities. Now, rather than drawing this, I'm just going to mention that governments can obviously overregulate, overtax, and overcompensate for pollution, and that's rather simple to see. Let me just go ahead and move us back up to our diagram. That, and I'm not going to draw this, but I can just go ahead and show you what it looks like by looking at this model. The government has obviously overreacted. Don't do this to your picture, but The government has overreacted if it pushes supply too far to the right. So if it pushes supply over here to S3, it's overcompensated for external costs, and it's pushed prices where it's actually pushed prices too high, and it's pushed the output rate too low. Now it's distorting the market. So long as government doesn't overregulate and overtax, it benefits the market. But when the government overtaxes and overregulates, it distorts the market. So the argument here is going to center around how big are those external costs, and that's the problem. How big are they? How detrimental? How costly is a certain type of pollution to third parties? That becomes the question. And of course, science is helpful in trying to decide this, but there's still a lot of uncertainty, and it's still unclear how certain types of pollution actually affect people. So no easy task to figure that out. So governments will usually be either underperforming, not doing enough, or they'll be too heavy-handed, which means they're doing too much. And again, this is usually because of a lack of information. It's difficult to assess how large those external costs are. Okay, that wraps up our study of negative externalities.